I was halfway through my first beer of the evening when my phone buzzed with a call that would change everything. It wasn't a number I recognized, but the voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, and laced with an urgency that made my stomach drop. "Jake, where the hell is the boat?" For a moment, I just stared at the water in front of me. The boat wasn't there. It was supposed to be docked just outside my property, right where the FBI had left it. The same boat they had explicitly told me not to touch under any circumstances. The same boat that, according to my highly annoying HOA president Karen Whitmore, was a violation of neighborhood aesthetics. A slow, sinking realization hit me. Karen. Of course, it was Karen. I shot up from my chair, nearly knocking over my beer, and ran to the edge of my dock. The usual hum of insects and distant boat motors filled the warm Florida air, but my boat, the FBI's boat, was nowhere in sight. Karen had finally gone too far. She nagged me about the boat from the moment I moved in. At first, it was polite but firm reminders taped to my door. Then, the official letters started coming. Then the fines. Then the HOA meetings where she dramatically pointed at a laminated aerial photo of my backyard as if my boat were a national security threat. "This neighborhood has standards, Mr. Reynolds. That thing does not belong here." I had ignored her, like any sane person would, but apparently, Karen had decided that she wasn't going to wait for me to comply. No, she had done the unthinkable, she had stolen it. And now the FBI was calling me about it. "Listen, Carter, I don't know how to say this, but I think my HOA president just stole your boat." There was a pause on the line. Then, very slowly, the agent spoke again. "Tell me you're joking." I wasn't. And the worst part? I already knew Karen wasn't just taking it for a quick joyride. She was the kind of person who saw herself as the sheriff of the neighborhood, convinced she was above the rules, above reason, and above common sense. I could already picture her smugly revving the engine, probably dragging her poor, terrified husband Doug along for the ride. "Okay," Carter said, his voice suddenly clipped and all business. "Listen to me very carefully. That boat is rigged with federal tracking and security features. If they try to tamper with it, alarms will go off. If they go too far, we'll be able to find it. But if something happens to the contents inside..." He didn't finish the sentence, and honestly, I didn't need him to. I already knew that boat wasn't just some fancy government ride. It was evidence. I took a deep breath, wiping a hand down my face. How bad are we talking here? If she opens the wrong compartment? Let's just say the charges will be a lot worse than grand theft. That was all I needed to hear. I was already heading for my truck. I peeled out of my driveway so fast that my tires left skid marks, Max barking from the passenger seat as if he, too, could sense the disaster unfolding. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Karen wasn't just nosy, she was relentless. She had once tried to fine an elderly woman for hanging a wind chime because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. This was a woman who had measured my lawn with a ruler and left a note in my mailbox stating that it was 0.3 inches too tall. If she had stolen the boat, she wasn't going to gently cruise it back to the dock. No, she was probably giving herself a full-blown tour of the lake, basking in the glory of what she thought was a job well done. And I was right. By the time I reached the marina, I spotted her. Well, more specifically, I spotted the boat, a sleek, government-issued, high-powered vessel tearing across the water like it was the Daytona 500. And there she was, standing at the helm like she was the goddamn captain of the HOA Navy. Doug sat next to her, gripping the sides of the seat so tightly his knuckles were white. Even from the dock, I could hear Karen's voice echoing across the water as she gestured wildly, explaining something, probably to herself, since Doug looked like he was reconsidering his entire life. But Karen's victory lap was about to be very, very short-lived. A loud, mechanical screech rang out over the lake. Then another. The boat's lights suddenly flashed red, the engine hiccuped, and just like that, it locked up completely. I heard Karen's voice again, only this time, she was screaming. The boat jerked violently to a stop, sending her stumbling backward. A deep, monotone voice blasted from hidden speakers embedded in the hull. Unauthorized access detected. Federal vehicle lockdown engaged. Doug let out a sound that was part sob, part terrified squeak. Karen, still believing she could control the situation, started pushing buttons. That was exactly what she shouldn't have done. Alarms blared from inside the boat. Red and blue emergency lights lit up the water, making it look like a floating police raid on steroids. The speakers boomed again, this time even louder. Security alert activated. Authorities en route. And just like that, every law enforcement officer in the area was coming straight for them. Karen finally started to panic, spinning around to Doug like he was supposed to have some kind of solution. Doug, for his part, looked like he was actively considering jumping overboard and swimming for his life. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, and exhaled slowly. "Oh, Karen," I muttered, shaking my head. "You have no idea what you just did." In the distance, I could already hear the sound of approaching sirens and helicopters. And for once in my life, I couldn't wait to see how this HOA meeting was going to turn out. Karen was still pressing buttons frantically when the first police boat appeared, sirens wailing and lights flashing across the water. Doug, who had been gripping the sides of his seat like his life depended on it, finally cracked under the pressure. He stood up, waving his arms in surrender, his voice shaky and desperate. "We didn't steal it. It was just a neighborhood intervention." Karen snapped her head toward him, eyes wide with betrayal. "Doug! Shut up!" But Doug was already a broken man. He had spent years following Karen's ridiculous HOA rules, nodding along to her endless lectures about community standards, and repainting the fence every time she decided beige wasn't the right shade of beige. Now, in the face of actual federal consequences, he was done. He turned to the approaching officers and pointed directly at his wife. "It was her idea. I told her it was a bad one. I told her the FBI might own it, but she just kept saying, 'They can't leave junk in our neighborhood, Doug.'" Karen turned a shade of red that could only be described as HOA violation level crimson. The boat was now completely locked down. It had cut power to the engine, activated an internal tracking beacon, and sent its location straight to every law enforcement agency within 100 miles. Karen, still believing she was somehow the authority in this situation, threw her arms in the air and stomped toward the bow. "Excuse me," she shouted at the police boats now surrounding her. "This is completely unnecessary. I was merely relocating this vessel to a more appropriate location. The HOA has very strict rules." A booming voice from a megaphone cut her off. "Ma'am, step away from the controls and keep your hands where we can see them." Karen let out a huff, crossing her arms. "You're being ridiculous. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one." That was the exact moment the FBI helicopter appeared overhead. The roar of the rotor blades drowned out whatever argument she had been preparing. The neighborhood, now fully aware that something major was happening, had gathered along the shoreline, some filming with their phones, others just enjoying the spectacle of the unquestioned queen of the HOA finally losing control. Doug, realizing there was no winning here, slowly sat back down in his seat, shaking his head. "We're going to jail," he muttered. Karen, still unwilling to admit defeat, pointed an accusatory finger at the approaching agents. "You have no right to do this. Do you know who I am?" From the police boat, a man in a sharp black suit and sunglasses, flanked by 2 armed officers, simply stepped forward. "Yes," he said calmly. "You're the woman who just stole federal property and activated a security lockdown on a classified law enforcement vehicle." Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but the agent wasn't done. "And if that wasn't bad enough, you attempted to flee, cause property damage, and just now." He gestured at the sirens, the armed officers, the helicopter overhead. "Wasted an enormous amount of government resources because you didn't like looking at a boat in your neighborhood." Doug groaned and put his head in his hands. Karen, however, was still trying to hold on to whatever authority she thought she had. "I am the president of the HOA," she snapped. "And I will not be treated like some common criminal." The agent, who had clearly dealt with people like Karen before, let out a slow breath before pulling out a folder. "Ma'am, you are under investigation for grand theft, interference with a federal operation, and destruction of property." Karen's face twitched. "That's absurd. I was performing a civic duty." The agent simply turned the folder around and let her see the legal documentation inside. It was thick. "You will be taken into custody and questioned about your role in this incident," he continued. "At this time, I advise you not to say anything else unless you'd like to add obstruction of justice to your list of charges." For the first time since this started, Karen's bravado faltered. She turned to Doug, as if expecting him to do something, but Doug just gave her a look that said, "You did this to yourself." Jake, watching from the dock, took a long, satisfied sip of his beer. Karen was placed in cuffs, protesting the entire time. "This is harassment. I have rights. You can't just—" She was cut off as the agent casually gestured to one of the officers. "Escort her to the car, please." Doug, not in cuffs but thoroughly defeated, was led away as well. "Can I just call my lawyer first?" he asked weakly. "Absolutely," the officer said. "You're gonna need one." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but watching Karen get taken down by the full force of law enforcement was an all-time highlight. As the squad cars pulled away, he turned to Agent Carter, who had been standing near the dock with his arms crossed. "Well," Jake said, "I gotta admit, this was a lot more exciting than our usual HOA meetings." Carter let out a dry chuckle, tucking the folder under his arm. "You know, I wasn't sure if you were exaggerating about your neighborhood president." Jake laughed. "If anything, I toned it down." Carter shook his head, looking toward the street where Karen was still yelling about wrongful arrest. "We'll be in touch if we need anything else from you." Jake nodded. "Any chance you guys will forget to release her back into society?" Carter smirked. "No promises." As the last of the flashing lights disappeared, the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, muttering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Some were still recording, while others were already discussing what would happen next in the HOA. Jake finally turned back to his house, stretching his arms with a satisfied sigh. He had a feeling this wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, it was Karen who had to deal with the consequences, not him. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the time Karen was hauled off in a squad car, half the town had already seen the footage online. Someone had even edited a video with dramatic music, slow-motion zoom-ins, and a flashing "Karen gets arrested" title. It had racked up thousands of views in just a few hours. HOA meetings had always been heated, but no one had ever expected the president to be the subject of a federal investigation. Jake sat on his porch the next morning, sipping his coffee while scrolling through the comments under the now viral video. People from all over the country were chiming in. Some were cheering for her downfall. Others were arguing over whether an HOA had the power to steal a boat. A few conspiracy theorists were convinced she was a deep state operative. The best comments so far had been from an account named LakeDude99, which simply read, "Justice served with a side of HOA tears." Max, his German shepherd, stretched out on the porch next to him, enjoying the peaceful morning. It was the first time in weeks that Jake hadn't woken up to some passive-aggressive HOA note taped to his door. No demands about lawn height. No threats about fines. Just quiet. He could get used to this. Later that day, the official HOA meeting was held, though the atmosphere was more like a funeral. The board members sat in stunned silence as they tried to figure out what to do now that their self-appointed dictator was facing multiple felony charges. A few members hesitantly suggested waiting to see if she would be released, but that was quickly shot down when someone pointed out that it might take months, if not years, before Karen was legally able to return. Doug showed up looking like a broken man. He had spent the night at his brother's house and had been seen wandering the grocery store that morning, muttering to himself in the frozen food aisle. He didn't even attempt to defend Karen. When someone asked if she had any regrets, he simply shook his head and said, "She still thinks she was right." The vote to remove Karen from her position was unanimous. Within minutes, her reign was officially over. The relief was palpable. People were already discussing plans to undo half the ridiculous rules she had enforced. The neighborhood could finally breathe again. Jake wasn't sure how long Karen would be in legal trouble, but he knew one thing for sure: she wasn't coming back to power. There was no recovering from this. She had stolen a boat from the FBI. Not an abandoned dinghy, not some random citizen's fishing vessel, but a fully equipped federal surveillance boat. That was the kind of mistake that followed you for life. A few days later, a delivery truck pulled up in front of Jake's house. He hadn't ordered anything, so he was confused until the driver stepped out and handed him an envelope. Inside was a short note. "Consider this your HOA compensation. Thanks for your cooperation. Carter." Jake frowned, then looked up as the truck's doors opened and the delivery crew rolled out a brand new speedboat. It was sleek, high-powered, and probably cost more than his house. His jaw nearly hit the ground. The FBI had given him a boat. A real, government-approved, legally his boat. As the delivery crew secured it in his driveway, a small crowd started gathering. His next-door neighbor, Mike, whistled low. "You gotta be kidding me," he said. "They just gave you a boat?" Jake held up the note. "Apparently." More neighbors started coming out, staring at the boat like it was some kind of legendary artifact. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very thing that Karen had fought so hard to remove was now permanently parked in Jake's driveway, and it was even bigger and flashier than before. Someone in the crowd started laughing. A few more joined in. Within minutes, half the neighborhood was cracking up at the sheer poetic justice of it all. Jake leaned against the boat, grinning. "Guess the HOA will have to update their rulebook." That evening, the neighborhood held an impromptu celebration. It wasn't an official HOA event, no permits, no sign-in sheets, no Karen to oversee every minor detail. Just people coming together, grilling food, and enjoying the kind of freedom they hadn't had in years. Doug showed up for a little while, standing awkwardly near the drink table before finally speaking up. "I think I'm gonna sell the house," he admitted. "I can't stay here. Too many memories." No one argued. No one encouraged him to stay. They all understood. He had hitched his life to Karen's, and now he was paying the price. By the time the sun set, people were still talking about the whole ordeal. Some were planning to officially disband the HOA, while others just wanted to make sure no one like Karen ever took control again. There was a new sense of unity in the air, something that had been missing for a long time. Jake, sitting on his porch with Max curled up beside him, took one last sip of his beer and watched the night unfold. For once, everything felt right. He looked over at the boat, then down at Max. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Max thumped his tail lazily, unconcerned with the complexities of HOA politics. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, me neither." Across the street, someone lit a small round of fireworks, sending sparks into the night sky. The neighborhood cheered. Karen was gone. The HOA was crumbling. And best of all, Jake had a brand new boat, courtesy of the very government agency that had been at the center of all the chaos. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the neighborhood finally belonged to the people again.